Today, we continue with the second half of the news for this past month, as it relates to the Disney company, its films, and its parks. And we jump in here to another unusual set of stories, but first, let me set them up with a little context in terms of the unique ways that the Disney company is relating to the current economy. For the past year, economists have debated whether or not the U.S. is headed toward a recession. In terms of indicators, there are positive and negative indicators about the likelihood of a recession in the near future. In terms of positive indicators, the current unemployment rate remains at 3.7%, near historic lows. Some other indicators are leaning more toward neutral, if a little positive in their outlook. The University of Michigan Consumer Confidence Survey measures how confident consumers are in the future of the economy, which includes their own job security and income. This indicator rises when consumers generally feel confident in a strong economy, which leads to increased spending, and it falls when consumers are more concerned about the near future. Consumer confidence is down a little in the most recent report, coming in at 63.5, dipping 3.5 points from its mark at 67 in February, but nowhere near the low of 50 of last June. This, too, is mostly a good indicator. The most significant negative indicator remains inflation. Inflation is far higher than economists want it to be. It's at 4.93%, but also it's down from that 8% number where it was this time last year. There are definitely some points of concerns that America may be headed into a recession, but also most economists don't presently believe that we're in a recession. But regardless, the Disney company, at least in terms of its parks, is acting as though the United States is in a recession. Though overall inflation remains at just under 5%, the cost of some elements as they relate to a Disney World vacation is far more than that, particularly airfare, hotel, and food purchased away from home. It's been no secret that Disney World was moving into a period of reduced hotel reservations. From a few conversations, the number that I've heard is that reservations are down at Disney World around 20% for the rest of the year. So last month, when Disney World discounted most everything from hotel rooms to multi-day tickets over the summer, and even to the cost of the kids' dining plan when that dining plan starts up again, that really came as no surprise to anyone who watches this industry. As a complete side note, historically, one of the least busy periods at the Florida resort is between August 15th and September 30th. This year, I expect the Florida parks to be particularly empty during those weeks, particularly Monday through Thursday. If you had an entirely open schedule and wanted to visit the Florida resort for a few days, I think that weekdays during the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th weeks of September would be a really good time to visit. Rooms, tickets, and Genie Plus prices will be low, and the parks should be unusually empty. The only park that may feel a bit crowded is Hollywood Studios, mostly because it's such a small park. But back to the main point here. No one was particularly surprised by the discounting at Disney World in terms of tickets and rooms. The signs were all there. What's more surprising is that this past week, the California resort joined Florida with highly discounted tickets for the summer months. The tickets are good for California locals. But considering that summer has some of the highest ticket prices of the year, this is an unusually good deal. A standard one-park midweek ticket any time in July is $159 for a single day. California locals can now get 3 days for $249 or $83 per day. If you want to go on weekends, the price goes up to $299 or $100 per day. So with this, the soft attendance outlook that has been clear in Florida for a while is now shaping ticket sales on the West Coast as well. And there's more. Though historically, discounted tickets have been offered to Southern California residents, that is, from San Diego up to Santa Barbara County, This current batch of discounts is offered to residents of the entire state, including residents of Wairika, which is about 650 miles away from Disneyland. For the California resort, these tickets perform a unique function. A typical California visitor may be interested in visiting Disneyland for a single day over the summer for $159. But then they notice that they can visit for 3 days for just $90 more. This turns a single-day visit into 3 separate visits to the parks. That is, these tickets are specifically designed to increase the amount of days that a visitor spends in the parks. In terms of pricing, Disney is presently treating summer, which is usually a peak season, as though the visitation forecasts are similar to February, when such deals for locals typically exist. And so, even though the United States may not presently be in or even headed toward a recession, and even though the S&P 500 officially turned into a bull market this past week, which means that the market has risen 20% since its recent lows, in terms of destination vacations, many families are acting though a recession is coming, and the Disney company itself is acting like a recession, or at least a significant economic downturn, is here and will affect their business model at least through the end of the year. And that is one general context for our show today: changing times and how Disney is responding. But before we get into the stories, I need to thank another round of recent Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast, so these are the people who keep this whole operation running. Without them, we'd simply need to shut down. Gratitude is going out today to Mr. Pearl, Mad Huntin', Weary Mom 22, Tom, AJ, CHD, Hey P. Scott, Leslie, Wick, and Eric A. Thanks to each of you for supporting this show. And so with that, I think we're now all ready to jump down into another set of stories that outline the current state and future of the Disney company, its films, and its parks. We have a chunky episode today that's going to cover a lot of ground. So, if you've got your cruise control set, if you've got your walking shoes laced up, let's go. Let's start with this, the story of Disney, the parks, and augmented reality. Disney has been a longtime partner with Apple. In the early days of iTunes, Disney's classic cartoon shorts were among the first video offerings for sale on the Apple site. Disney was a day one participant with the Apple Watch and Apple Pay, and now Apple has new tech coming in 2024, a unique virtual reality and augmented reality headset called Vision Pro. The headset has been under development at Apple for the past 8 years, and it moves into territory where other tech giants have failed. About 10 years ago, Google introduced Google Glass, but limited adoptions and some social stigmas associated with the glasses eventually caused Google to walk away from this project. Then there was Meta's attempt to make the Oculus VR headsets mainstream. I wouldn't say this failed. They have a loyal following among gamers and VR enthusiasts, but Meta's main goal of making VR headsets mainstreamed never really happened. Apple, though, has a unique history of making fringe technology look cool. Their marketing and PR teams are primed to reposition new tech, getting celebrities to wear them and creating TV shots with cool music and print campaigns in which new tech is suddenly seen as iconic, like a pair of Ray-Bans. The Vision Pro headset isn't out yet, but from promotional video and the rollout event, the Vision Pro appears to be a massive upgrade to Meta's Oculus virtual reality headset. Most significantly, As it's an augmented reality headset and not just a VR headset, Vision Pro allows you to see the room you are in while also watching programs or using apps. For example, right now, I'm sitting at my kitchen table. If I was wearing a Vision Pro headset, I'd still see the table recreated inside of the headset on a screen, but I'd also see other elements that aren't on the table, such as a floating window with a web browser in it, or another floating window with a word processing screen inside of that. If someone enters the room, I can see them, and the Vision Pro has an external screen that allows visitors to see my eyes and expressions even while I have the headset on. But the most important thing here is that this AR headset places digital elements on a screen that make them appear as though they exist in the world around me. So what does any of this have to do with Disney? Well, maybe a little or maybe an awful lot. Disney Plus will be a day one offering on the Vision Pro headset. From the promo materials, there also appears to be various VR Disney, Marvel, Star Wars games in the works. But beyond this, Vision Pro is going to be the format for something that has been long hinted at within the Disney company. Last September, then CEO Bob Chapek explained that there were 90% of people that will never ever be able to get to a Disney park, and that the company was then developing an option that would allow them to visit, or at least to virtually visit. And this past week, current CEO Bob Iger explained how Disney was partnering with Apple to create experiences and content for the Vision Pro. He explained that the headset would allow Disney to create deeply personal experiences that will bring fans closer to the characters they love and more deeply immersed in Disney stories. And then on the screen was an image of a Disney park and parade. The suggestion here was that the Vision Pro was going to be the technology where Disney created ways to virtually visit their parks. And this, to some, I know only sounds a little new. Currently over on YouTube, you can find a handful of VR 180 videos of the parks produced by fans. Personally, I think that these are amazing VR experiences. 2 years ago here at DHI, we put together a VR tour of Avengers Campus on the day the land premiered at DCA as a way of gauging how much interest there was in VR 3D videos of new experiences at the parks. It was an interesting experience. We had the video edited and rendered for both 2D and 3D viewing up and on the DHI feed a few days after the Avengers Campus opened. It took a few days because the two video images for each shot, one for the left eye and another for the right eye, needed to be first stitched together and then rendered before the video could be edited. But my observation, at least back in 2021, was that there wasn't yet enough interest in this type of VR experiences of the parks. There were pockets of interest, but they were fairly small. In the months that followed, we watched Google pull a good deal of its support for VR 180, making it considerably more difficult to arrange VR 180 3D videos for the web. In terms of overall interest, the VR video of Avengers Campus didn't get much traction even though it had no real competition. It received a few views. In contrast, when we post videos of Disneyland as it appeared in the 1950s and 1960s, those all get hundreds of thousands of views. But maybe with Apple on board, there will soon be far deeper interest in VR content. If nothing else, Apple is a company that can move the needle on how tech is perceived, which is what it will need to do to get this product moving forward. And in that too, there's a challenge. Apple usually picks up existing and successful categories of tech and then radically improves them. That is, it tends to design tech for an existing audience. There were already MP3 players back in the late 1990s, but the Apple iPod in the early aughts improved that experience. There were already smartphones such as the BlackBerry, but then the Apple iPhone improved that experience. There were already wearable tech watches such as the Fitbit, but the Apple smartwatch improved that experience as well. But in terms of the Vision Pro augmented reality headset, there's not existing consumer headsets like them, nor is there an existing large market for them. This time around, Apple doesn't simply need to convince its audience that its first-gen smartphone is a better option than what's already out there. As there's no category of app-based AR headsets that exist, Apple first needs to convince its audience that it needs this product, that it needs it to find new avenues of enjoyment and greater productivity. And if Apple is able to do this, if it's able to present the Vision Pro as the type of product that most consumers will soon think is not only useful, but also entertaining and cool, and that, I should point out, is a huge if, I see a lot of interesting questions that follow for Disney and particularly for the parks. The first question: if there's a virtual reality of Disneyland or Disney World, will that increase or decrease interest in visiting the parks in person? That is, does VR content work like an ad that ultimately creates more interest in those viewers visiting the actual parks? Or does VR content satisfy people's curiosity so that they no longer need to visit as often? Second, as this is an augmented reality headset and not just a VR headset, which means that you can see the world around you, but perhaps with an animated version of Mickey sitting there on the couch beside you, is Disney considering some application where people wearing the headset will have unique experiences while physically in the parks? And I don't mean that they're considering this for that first generation of the Vision Pro. Presently, the Vision Pro needs an external battery pack, and the battery only lasts 2 hours. I mean a later version of the Vision Pro. The goal here for Apple is clearly over generations to take the current Vision Pro and to reduce it to something about the size of sunglasses, and also to increase battery life so that one charge lasts all day. We are, of course, years away from that, maybe 7 or 8 years, but that's the path. And if this headset will eventually be a pair of glasses, is the full plan for the parks to leverage this technology. So when wearing an AR headset, the experience of being in the parks changes radically. And from a certain perspective, this is historically what theming is all about. In the 1950s, Walt used Hollywood set designers to make the experience of being inside the park look and feel different than the experience of being outside of the park. And if that is one serious end of theming, wouldn't then a sophisticated augmented reality headset be a useful tool in advancing this concept of theming? You'd still look through your augmented reality glasses and see Main Street there in front of you, but on the screen, you'd find 3D digital elements mixed in with reality. And if WDI experiments with these options, what do you think would be the most engaging elements that AR might produce in the parks? Characters that talk to you? Maybe daytime fireworks over the castle, or buildings that move and sway with the music? Or is the world of parks for you best left without any more digital enhancements? Third, Chapek's statement last year seemed to suggest that the Vision Pro might be a way for 90% of the people who can't physically visit a park to virtually visit one. To be clear here, virtual visitation of the parks, or really of anywhere, would be at best a minor use of an expensive mixed VR-AR headset, but with a price tag starting at $3,500, I'm guessing that most of the 90% of the world presently unable to visit the parks will also be unable to afford the headset as well. or even a later third-generation headset when the price finally drops to the point where it can be a relatively common, if expensive, piece of consumer technology. So the audience for the Apple headset seems to be Westerners who are financially able to visit the Disney parks at least once if they choose. So aside from the novelty of seeing the parks in 3D while sitting on your own couch, what's the benefit for Disney in terms of creating a virtual park experience for a limited audience who presumably could already visit the parks if they so wanted? Or what's the benefit to Disney in recreating the experience of being in the parks on a VR headset? I'm sure that Disney has gamed out various results and has very specific ideas as to how a park's presence on this new headset will help the parks, but I'm not sure that I understand what it is yet. But beyond these questions about Disney, there's a bigger one about the product itself. The Apple headset is big and formidable. No one is probably going to want to wear it for hours, yet this is the starting point of the argument where over years, through repeated exposure and explanations, Apple may convince hundreds of thousands of people that they need this headset. And also, this is the starting point of a much smaller and lighter design that will also be rolled out over years. And as these later versions of the headset come out, Apple's basic argument will likely be this: the Vision Pro will use the exact same apps as on computers, such as MS Word, which will allow you to do work, and perhaps more productively with more screens, on the headset. Another part of the argument will be enhanced entertainment, whether that be 3D immersive movies or virtual trips to the Magic Kingdom. The third piece of this argument will likely be that the Vision Pro will allow you to take 3D videos with spatial sound that will allow you to relive these moments later. But are these options going to be enough to actually interest the public? And if so, is this going to be the device that widely launches VR and AR experiences inside of the Disney parks? Disney, at least, seems to think that there are some interesting possibilities here. It's going to take 4, maybe 5 years to know if this headset takes off or if it's going to fade like Google Glass. Anyway, Disney has presently signed on to the project. So in the coming years, we will see how all of this plays out. Remember, it took about 4 or 5 years after the first iPhones came out until suddenly they were everywhere. This happened somewhere around the iPhone 4 or 5. It will probably take just as long here to see the actual future for the Vision Pro. But if this does pan out, fans are going to have new and compelling ways to feel as though they are at the parks, and Imagineering is going to have a new set of tools to create unique and highly believable experiences that happen in the park, so long as you have your 7th, 8th, or 9th generation version of Vision Pro with you. You'll see another layer of this lovely themed world that exists now only inside of the glasses and not in the actual physical space around you. Our next story I like to call the Big Reset of 2023. By now, I believe that most listeners probably know that the Galactic Starcruiser, that 2-day Star Wars experience, will close at the end of September for good, after being open for roughly a year and a half. Listeners also probably know that Disney has canceled its Lake Nona campus in Florida. I was in Florida as these announcements were rolled out. Among those who worked for Disney that I talked to on that trip, no one was surprised that Disney was finally shuttering Lake Nona. But everyone was surprised that the Starcruiser was closing at the end of the summer. Let's briefly talk about Lake Nona, as I think this is the more straightforward closure, and then we'll move on to the Starcruiser. In 2021, Lake Nona was initially announced as a second corporate campus on the East Coast for the Disney company. Disney would transfer hundreds of jobs from its Burbank studio and Glendale campus to Florida, which would then become home to parks, experiences, and products. So everything from Imagineering to publishing to the cruise lines to consumer goods would be in Florida. The campus would have divided the Disney company so that the West Coast was primarily home to media and film production, along with streaming, linear networks, general distribution, and promotion, and the East Coast was home to most everything else. When the move was initially announced, many in Imagineering decided to quit rather than relocate, resulting in a wave of departures that depleted the main Imagineering campus in Glendale by hundreds and hundreds of people. During this period, which also included some pandemic-era layoffs, the Glendale Imagineering campus lost somewhere around 60% of its workforce. The move to Florida was also unpopular with many in the products division. On May 17th, a few weeks ago, initially with internal memos, Disney announced that it was canceling its plans to establish a corporate campus in Lake Nona, Florida. Any Disney personnel who had already moved ahead of the campus opening would be given the opportunity to remain in Florida or be moved back to California. The official reason Disney gave was changing business conditions, which was surely a way to signal that this in part was collateral damage for the ongoing issues between Disney and the state of Florida. The issues with Reedy Creek and the two lawsuits between Disney and the state of Florida may have been the tipping point that moved Disney to cancel this campus, but the problems with the relocation were evident even before this. I'm not even sure that Disney still had 2,000 people to transfer. Some of those jobs would likely need to be filled once the campus opened, and those jobs were high-paying white-collar jobs with an average yearly salary of $130,000. Those jobs, for the most part, now will be reabsorbed by California. The loss of the Lake Nona campus also removes a $1 billion project from Central Florida and also removes an industry anchor for the developing Lake Nona area. This was generally the narrative that Disney was striving for, essentially that the ongoing issues with Governor DeSantis would have a financial consequence for Disney's involvement in the region. Given the considerable changes that have occurred since the announcement of this project, Disney executive Josh D'Amaro wrote his team, including new leadership and changing business conditions, we have decided not to move forward with the construction of the campus. This was not an easy decision to make, but I believe it was the right one. In a later announcement, Jeff Vail, president of Walt Disney World, also pointed out that Disney was still planning to invest heavily in Florida, but now only at the resort. Our plans currently call for us to invest $17 billion in Walt Disney World over the next 10 years, he wrote, and create 13,000 new jobs to continue doing our part as a leading employer in the hospitality and themed entertainment industry. We hope these plans will become a future reality. This announcement didn't say this outright, but the majority of these jobs are almost surely hourly jobs, not the type of high-paying jobs once earmarked for Lake Nona. The inclusion of these lines was mostly positive, a reminder that Disney remained committed to growth at the Florida resort, but also there was a very small note of threat in it as well. With that closing line, we hope those plans will become a future reality, a reminder that there was another basket of jobs that Florida might lose as well. Following this announcement, Governor DeSantis presented his own narrative, namely that the cancellation of this expansion was a sign that the Disney company was facing difficult economic times and no longer had the resources for expansion. Disney announced the possibility of a Lake Nona campus nearly 2 years ago, he said. Nothing ever came of the project, and the state was unsure whether it would come to fruition. Given the company's financial straits, falling market cap, and declining stock price, it is unsurprising that they would restructure their business operations and cancel unsuccessful ventures. There is some truth in DeSantis' interpretation of these events. Disney's stock price has recently fallen, but more significantly, over the last couple of months, Disney has been cutting jobs through strategic layoffs, reducing its corporate footprint by 7,000 positions. To open a new campus at this point would almost surely mean increased hiring, something that would be met with resentment by those who endured the anxious period of recent layoffs. For me personally, I'm a little surprised that Disney walked away from Lake Nona in 2023. Disney acquired the land from the Lake Nona Property Holdings Company. As part of the overall agreement, Disney needed to develop roughly half the land by 2028 and the remaining half by 2031, or sell the land back to the holding company. That is, Disney had years to mull over this decision. Also, if they built the Lake Nona campus, Disney would have received an absolutely massive tax credit, up to $570 million against this $1 billion project. I thought that this tax break alone was likely to keep Disney treading water on the project until the next election cycle, which might have provided a reset on Disney's troubles in state. But the decision to walk away from Lake Nona now suggests at least three things. First, there is an actual concern now about long-term change in the business and governmental structure of Florida. Second, the company had underestimated how unwilling key parties were to relocate from California to Florida. And lastly, as we discussed last month, the company likely felt they needed to visually demonstrate how the state benefited from Disney's involvement and how Disney had the ability to increase or lower that level of support based on their treatment in state. The permanent closure of the Galactic Starcruiser is a little more difficult to work through. Also on May 18th, Disney announced that the Galactic Starcruiser would close permanently on September 30th. The official announcement read, Star Wars Galactic Starcruiser is one of our most creative projects ever and has been praised by our guests and recognized for setting a new bar for innovation and immersive entertainment. This premium experience gave us the opportunity to try new things on a smaller scale of 100 rooms, and we will take what we've learned to create future experiences that can reach more of our guests and fans. We will be contacting guests booked for voyages departing on or after September 30th to discuss their options and modify their plans. To prioritize these guests, we are pausing new bookings until May 26th. And then on the morning of May 26th, reservations reopened for new guests. Later that day, every last spot in the remaining voyages sold out. Guests who have been aboard the Starcruiser generally give it positive reviews despite its high cost. And this past year, the Starcruiser won the Thea Award for Outstanding Achievement, which essentially is like an Academy Award for theme park attractions. That is, to explore this, we need to frame our discussion around the positives, that is, those things that were working, and also the negatives, those things that caused problems, to understand why this exactly was canceled despite good reviews. The closure here is not like Harmonious, which left an 8-story eyesore in the middle of World Showcase Lagoon all day, nor is it like the revised Journey into Your Imagination, which needed to be quickly revised due to low guest satisfaction. Though guests might quibble about the lack of Darth Vader and Luke on the Starcruiser, the experience overall was well received. Even in the weeks leading up to the announcement of its closing, an Imagineering team was exploring ways to change the dinner show and even develop a new script, likely with new experiences set in the Mandoverse, featuring Mando and Grogu, characters who are far more popular with contemporary audiences than Rey and Kylo. The company is almost surely eyeing the closure in purely financial terms. Disney's fiscal year begins on October 1st, so the Galactic Starcruiser will close out its final voyage during the last days of the fourth quarter of this fiscal year. This allows Disney to take a massive tax write-off this year as opposed to next year. I believe that most of this write-off is related to the actual cost of the building, not so much the cost of developing the experience. In a presentation for the J.P. Morgan Global Technology Media Communications Conference, Josh D'Amaro, chairman of Disney Parks, explained that Disney would claim a massive tax write-down in the third and fourth quarters of this fiscal year. I don't think we've talked about this before, but in Q3 and Q4, as we accelerate depreciation on the Starcruiser, we should expect about $100 to $150 million acceleration in depreciation, he said. Overall, I believe this means that Disney will write down about $100 million in the third quarter, essentially ending in June, and about $150 million in the fourth quarter, ending in September. This essentially is the construction cost for the Starcruiser building and its stage equipment. Disney, I think, is going to fully depreciate the value of the constructed Starcruiser experience, but this was only a fraction of the overall development costs. Beyond the actual construction and staging costs, there were the R&D costs to develop the concept and design the show equipment. Those were even more than construction costs, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So the big question is this: what went wrong? There's some obvious things to point to, such as the Galactic Starcruiser didn't feel like an integral presentation of Star Wars. Galaxy's Edge, on the other hand, got visual design right. Domed buildings feel like Star Wars, the presentation of the Millennium Falcon feels like Star Wars, and most of all, being taken to a Star Destroyer, where there are Imperial walkers and stormtroopers on board, feels like Star Wars. The Galactic Starcruiser wasn't something that Star Wars fans had seen before, nor did its interiors look like the interiors of ships that exist in the Star Wars universe. In terms of an overall sci-fi universe, it felt a little generic. Also, the experience was tied to the third trilogy, which was simply never as popular or as iconic as the original trilogy. But in the end, I don't think that this was the large underlying problem. As mentioned earlier, and as reported elsewhere, Disney did explore options to redo the Starcruiser experience with a different set of characters, specifically with Mando and Baby Grogu. There was also a discussion to make the Starcruiser a day-long immersive activity, but ultimately Bob Iger decided not to pursue either of these options. And here is where, at least as I read this, the real problem lies. The R&D costs to develop the Starcruiser were reportedly massive, likely 3 times the cost to build the Starcruiser in Florida by itself, bringing the total price tag for this project to $1 billion. The initial plan was to spread the R&D cost over multiple Starcruisers. There were exploratory plans at one point to clone the Starcruiser in California, and after Paris got its own Galaxy's Edge, to build one there too. But plans for these Starcruiser clones were eventually scrapped, and in Paris the entire Galaxy's Edge project was removed as well. Initially, any redesign or rescripting cost could have been spread out over 3 Starcruisers, but now if Disney created a new story or designed new stage equipment for the Starcruiser, it would need to be justified by income from the Lone Starcruiser, that one in Florida. And with this, there was a math problem, which added to already existing math problems. I've mapped out ideally what the Starcruiser can bring in a single year if all rooms are booked without discounts. It's right around $140 million, which is a massive amount of money. But also, what this last year showed is that the Starcruiser, once opened, had no way to get anywhere near that figure on a reliable basis. Ideally, the Starcruiser would run 3 two-day trips each week, but as rooms were empty, that schedule was cut back to just 2 trips a week, with the Starcruiser occasionally closed. But even on that reduced schedule, the Starcruiser didn't fill rooms. Some 2-day adventures were over half empty, with people estimating that roughly 40% of capacity was reached. This led to discounting to fill empty rooms. For this coming summer, initially, most anyone could have booked a room for a 30% discount. Even with that, those cruises that were still running didn't fill. With discounting canceled cruises and a partially filled hotel, the actual income for the Starcruiser drops significantly. Assuming all rooms are discounted 30%, assuming there are 2 cruises a week with the hotel remaining empty for 3 days each week, and assuming those cruises are running at an optimistic 75% of capacity, the Starcruiser is then not pulling in $140 million a year, it's pulling in less than $50 million a year, or $1 million a week, which is still a lot of money. To put this in perspective, the average McDonald's franchise brings in about $3 million of revenue a year, but perhaps $50 million a year for the Starcruiser may not have been enough to support a high labor operation on an ongoing basis. The Starcruiser is filled with equity actors and performers who make substantially more than front-of-the-line cast members. These performers are mostly there for an 8-hour period from late afternoon until roughly midnight. But still, there's a lot of them. There's also a dedicated culinary team, along with some very substantial food costs to run a kitchen for Starcruiser guests. I am guessing that this experience has the highest ratio of cast members to guests anywhere on property. And then there's this back-of-the-house team, a cross between story managers and stage tech that manages how the story is presented and plays out inside the Starcruiser. And with these costs, a budget of $1 million a week is probably not sustainable. I've tried to chart out the likely costs for this round-the-clock experience. I think that labor costs, particularly for management, equity actors, and the kitchen, may be as much as 25% of the overall $1 million per week budget. Then there are some hefty food costs, and maintenance, utilities, support facilities for costumes and props, internal transportation, advertising, promotion, to say nothing of the R&D cost that should ultimately be paid back, and the cost of the $250 million building. So at this lower level of visitation, I think it may be difficult to look at the Starcruiser as a long-term, sustainable venture. In looking at how quickly demand fell off for the original Starcruiser adventure, I'm guessing that the Disney Imagineering team modeled a similar drop-off for any new proposed storyline, maybe even with new on-ship experiences and new characters like Mando that had a larger fan base than Kylo and Rey. And I think this is probably where the problem lies. According to the Wrap, management now understood that there was a limited audience who were both interested and could afford the experience. Once you went through the 1%ers who could afford it and the fanatical Star Wars fans who would sell their mother to do it, you were done, a source inside Disney said. And this is where the overall audience context for the Disney parks matters. From its start, Disneyland as a park was directed at middle-class families. It was created by Walt Disney, a millionaire movie mogul who, even during the height of his success, mostly identified in his outlook and pleasures with those of the middle class. He made a park for people like himself. And that entire concept, a massive park for the middle class based on film genres that the middle class enjoyed, was a key identity point in the creation of Disneyland. Disneyland and Walt Disney World both have areas that gesture to the middle upper class. This is more true in Florida than it is in California, signature restaurants, deluxe hotels, and even hotel spas. But these experiences mostly target the upper middle class, not the upper class. For the truly wealthy, venues like the Grand Floridian and Citricos lack elements that the upper 2 or 3% are used to finding in a 5-star experience. But the price point of the Starcruiser, especially as a repeatable experience, suggested it was arranged for an audience whose income level was significantly above that of those who regularly stayed at the Grand Floridian or other deluxe offerings. That is, the identity of Disney World as a middle and upper middle class resort didn't match the function of the Starcruiser, which was an attraction arranged for a different income tier than the rest of the resort. So from this perspective, the Galactic Starcruiser was likely an unsustainable venture, at least one that would produce a reasonable profit. Under ideal circumstances, the Florida resort would have sold around 20,000 rooms a year for this two-night adventure. But that wasn't happening, not by a long shot. And with the high labor cost to create the experience every 2 days, I'm guessing to lower the price much more than the current 30% discount would have ruled out any possibility of running this experience long-term at profitable levels. So the big takeaway here is this: that lovely movie Field of Dreams may have been wrong when it said, if you build it, they will come. Disney World has a known and established identity that appeals to a certain socioeconomic audience. To build an experience that is significantly outside of those audience parameters, even if it's a very good to excellent one, isn't going to change the underlying demographic of the resort's core audience in any meaningful way. And the learning experience, hopefully here, is likely this: ultimately, it doesn't matter how engaging an experience is. If the resort needs to sell that experience to tens of thousands of families per year to remain profitable, that experience needs to fit within the income parameters of the core Disney World audience. Or let's put it this way: a round-the-world trip on a private jet with only 75 seats to all the Disney parks, priced at $150,000 per person, will likely sell out once a year. That is, there are seats for roughly 15 to 20 families. But an experience with a $5,000 to $6,000 starting point that needs tens of thousands of families each year to fill rooms isn't going to survive, because the core income center of the Disney Resort experience is substantially below this price point for the two-day experience. And so, let's hope that there's a meaningful takeaway here for Disney management, that any experience like this needs to fit within the spending parameters of the majority of the Disney World audience. Otherwise, such offerings will largely be alienating for fans as they can't experience them, and unprofitable for management as the audience for them will be too small. Our last segment today focuses on two restaurants that have recently reopened after substantial closures, one at the Disneyland Resort and the other at Disney World. Let's start on the West Coast with the Jazz Kitchen, which has recently been reimagined as the Jazz Kitchen Coastal Grill and Patio. To put this in context, Downtown Disney is once again going through a transformation of sorts, which will continue until the end of 2024. In terms of restaurant offerings, this transformation will accomplish three things. First, it should visually unify the table service restaurants with a mid-century modern aesthetic. Presently, Downtown Disney is a mishmash of styles, some of which are lovely and some a little bit less so. Second, it's going to move the cuisine more toward international menus similar to those at Disney Springs. Coming soon are two new upper-end Mexican restaurants, a bakery that specializes in Cuban offerings, and a Chinese restaurant specializing in soup and dumplings. And last, this transformation should upgrade and reposition many table service restaurants so that they are closer to the price range and menu offerings of table service restaurants at Disney Springs in Florida. The revised Jazz Kitchen easily fits inside of these categories, as does the two new Mexican restaurants, one a table service restaurant, the other an upscale outdoor tapas bar. Both of these south-of-the-border offerings are being developed by Michelin-starred chef Carlos Gaitan, and it's this last option, nudging the table service restaurants at Downtown Disney up so that they're closer to those at Disney Springs, that I think is going to be the most difficult to pull off successfully. But to focus in on the Jazz Kitchen, The old Jazz Kitchen held the whisper of New Orleans, with its wrought iron balconies, gas lanterns, and interior courtyard. The atmosphere was fabulous. The remodeled restaurant leans into that mid-century modern California fusion aesthetic, with orange rope chairs and matching orange sun umbrellas, and I find it a little difficult to evaluate the visuals of the restaurant because this is the first restaurant to open with this new mid-century design and color theme. At the moment, the Jazz Kitchen doesn't blend well with the other restaurants around it, nor does it have strong visual ties to the Crescent City. Its vibe may simply work better once other areas of downtown Disney open similar designs and color schemes. So for now, let's put the whole ambiance issue aside, other than to say that the restaurant feels a little out of step with its environment, though the environment will soon change. The menu has a lot of overlap with the previous incarnation of the Jazz Kitchen, with jambalaya, gumbo, shrimp and grits, and so on. But the menu has expanded the upper end and also now includes dishes that blend the cuisine of Los Angeles with that of Louisiana. Crawfish lettuce wraps and a shrimp remoulade stuffed avocado. Longtime offerings have also seen price increases, bumping many Jazz Kitchen favorites into the mid and upper $30 range. These elements are signaling part of the overall changes at Downtown Disney to embrace far more entree options that fall between $35 and $50. This model works well in Florida, where many families and nice hotels are there for 5 or 7 days to experience a luxurious vacation. The clientele at Downtown Disney is simply different than that of the Florida resort. With many universities nearby, Downtown Disney attracts a lot of college students, also families there for only a few hours. If you look at the restaurants that are consistently popular, such as Black Tap, which serves burgers, sandwiches, fries, and shakes, they speak to a different clientele than the type of table service offerings that Disney is moving into the shopping district, especially as the plan is to nudge those restaurants towards higher price points. When I was at Downtown Disney this past week, Black Tap, a modestly priced restaurant focused on hamburgers and shakes, had a 30-minute line going out its front door, while the Jazz Kitchen had a lot of empty tables, even though it was recently reopened. While there, I had the jambalaya with spinach fettuccine, which was flavorful. The pasta was perfectly cooked. The cream sauce had the right amount of spice. Overall, it was a solid dish, even if the shrimp and the andouille sausage was a little bit overcooked. Likewise, the seafood gumbo, served both as a cup or as an entree, was very good. The highlight of my meal, though, were the beignets, which were fabulous. Pillowy donuts dusted with powdered sugar. The good news here is that the beignets, with various sauces, are available right next door at a walk-up window called Beignets Expressed. And again here, the two sides of the Jazz Kitchen illustrate the clientele makeup of Downtown Disney. While the table service restaurant had some walk-up availability during the dinner hour, the counter service for beignets was completely packed, also with a line that appeared to be 20 to 30 minutes long. At the walk-up window, you can get 4 beignets for $10. And in looking at the future of Downtown Disney, I think it's going to be a difficult argument for Disney to effectively make, that some of these new restaurants that they are developing will need to bring in a slightly different customer base than those who presently come here. The menu items that I tried at the revised Jazz Kitchen, though generally good, had a price point slightly above their value. And as a quick side note and a helpful suggestion, the Craftsman Grill just down the way in the Grand Californian Hotel is a fabulous alternative. The food is as good, if not better, than the Jazz Kitchen, the price point is lower, and the atmosphere is absolutely lovely. But the concern about price and value is also one I have for the recently opened Narcoossee's at the Grand Floridian Resort at Disney World. Narcoossee's is one of the signature restaurants at Disney World's flagship resort, the Grand Floridian. It's a waterside pavilion whose windows open to the Seven Seas Lagoon and also to the Magic Kingdom. Nightly views of the fireworks are spectacular, with the aerial spectacle doubled as a reflection in the dark water. For roughly the past year, Narcoossee's has been closed for an extensive refurbishment. A little over a month ago, it finally reopened, and I was able to visit it in May. Arranged inside of a high-roof, turn-of-the-century pavilion, Narcoossee's is an open restaurant filled with the colors of sandalwood and cerulean, with wraparound windows that, during daylight hours, offer views of the castle and the contemporary. It's a far more casual restaurant and far less ornate than Flying Fish, the other signature seafood restaurant at the resort, and for me this is a better fit for Disney World overall. It feels like a restaurant that belongs at the Disney Resort, whereas for me, Flying Fish always feels like a restaurant that you might pick to close a business deal. In terms of its visuals, Narcoossee's sits in its environment better than most every other Disney restaurant. Toledo's feels a little like a restaurant at an American hotel, and the opulence of the Yachtsman doesn't blend well with its location just outside of Epcot. But with the lagoon views and very modest decorations, Narcoossee's as a seaside restaurant fits its surroundings perfectly. Each signature restaurant at the Florida Resort has its own social vibe. Though I regularly see families with kids in Topolino's, Toledo's, and California Grill, I rarely see many young kids here. So if you're looking for an adult's night out that leans towards the casual, Narcoossee's is an excellent option. The meal includes complimentary bread service, which is becoming a rarity on property. Here it's fresh sourdough with whipped butter. Of the appetizers, the two that rise to the top of the list are the fried calamari and the shrimp and grits. The calamari rings are soaked in buttermilk to tenderize them, then breaded and fried, served with a tomato coulis and pickled vegetables. The shrimp and grits are a smaller serving of low county grits topped with local shrimp from the Gulf. But the flavors that distinguish the shrimp and grits are the peach barbecue sauce paired with applewood smoked bacon. Entrees were a little trickier to work through. I'd avoid the New York strip and also the pork ribeye, neither of which were fabulous. And I'd stay with seafood, which is the specialty of the house. Among the best seafood is the blackened redfish, which is served tall, on a bed of vegetable hash and sweet corn and finished off with a red pepper rouille, which brings a layer of spice to an otherwise mild dish. Overall, Narcoossee's has good food in a lovely location with splendid views across the water of the park. In recent years, though, across property, with the exception of Disney Springs, signature dining has moved into lockstep pricing tiers. This means that New York strip steaks are roughly the same price from restaurant to restaurant. Most salmon dishes are the same price from restaurant to restaurant, and so on. And with this, the key question for most signature restaurants is always one of comparative value. Are the menu offerings at Narcoossee's among the best offerings at this lockstep price point? In the ecosystem of the Florida Resort, Disney could solve this problem by creating a pricing tier between table service and signature restaurants, which is generally where Narcoossee's should fall. The seafood dishes here are very good, but taking in the overall environment, I think the menu options here are priced slightly higher than they should be. So, back to that key question. If most signature restaurants have the same pricing tiers, is Narcoossee's simply price-wise one of the best uses of a signature dining experience? I'd have to say that there are better signature offerings at nearly identical price points. Before the pandemic, at the top of my list was Gico over at the Animal Kingdom Lodge. But post-pandemic, at the top of my list easily is Topolino's Terrace, a restaurant whose menu offerings in the standard signature category are among the best, if not the best, on property. Narcoossee's does have Topolino's beat on its water views, but other than that, Topolino's Terrace hits higher in other important areas. Another way of thinking about restaurant experiences is this. What do I remember most about the evening the following day? The aspect that I remember most about Narcoossee's was the superb location and the absolutely gorgeous views across the water of the Magic Kingdom. So if setting is significant for you, perhaps Narcoossee's justifies its prices. But the aspect that I remember most clearly about my most recent trip to Topolino's was the fettuccine alfredo with chicken that had been prepared with a wine reduction sauce. So in this, there are options for a signature dining experience. But if you're looking for a signature restaurant at one of the resorts for a special meal, I think that Topolino's has a little more going for it than Narcoossee's, but both, again, are very good. So, with our episode last week and the one this week, we've covered the news for the month, from problems at Pixar to the design of Tiana's Bayou Adventure to Disney's relationship with the Vision Pro and more. I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode. At least right now, the plan is to record another part in the story of Disney designer Rolly Crump. Also, today in our episode, we looked at the pros and cons of restaurants such as Narcoossee's. If you're planning a trip to Walt Disney World in the near future, over on Bandcamp, we've posted a range of audio reviews to help you pick the best experiences, including with dining. They are inside of a Bandcamp album that is presently marked Under Construction DHI Travel Guide to Walt Disney World. It's still under construction as more sections will be added over the summer. But presently, there are 11 different podcast chapters, each focused on a different aspect of the vacation experience. You can easily find those areas that most interest you just by looking at the titles. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. On Bandcamp, you can find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes, but the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber on Bandcamp at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.